Hello, everybody. It's early on Saturday, June the 14th, 2025. In the United States, it's No King's Day. In America, we don't do kings. National demonstrations all over the country, all focused on the current administration in the United States. The real question, though, is what people are demonstrating about. We've done a number of shows on what Trump is and isn't. According to John Rausch, who was on the show earlier this week, Trump isn't a fascist. He's what Rausch describes as a postmodern patrimonialist. Not everyone agrees. We also had Deborah Baker on the show. She has a wonderful new book out called Charlottesville, An American Story, and she identifies what's happening now in America as what happened in Charlottesville in 2017 as American fascism. My guest today on the show is all too familiar with fascism and anti-fascism. Mark Bray is the author of Antifa, the anti-fascist handbook, the classic study that came out during the Occupy period of how to resist fascism. The book is a bestseller, been enormously influential. Mark is joining us from New Brunswick in New Jersey. He's a professor of history at Rutgers University. Mark, happy No King's Day.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So let's get to the core of this. I'm guessing I know the answer, but are you in John Rausch's camp, who doesn't really see Trump as a fascist, or do you agree with Deborah Baker that what's currently happening in America is a form of American fascism?
Well, I think that what's happening in America is a form of American fascism, and I think that the MAGA movement is pretty unequivocally fascist. I've hesitated for a long time to straightforwardly call Trump a textbook fascist. I've talked about him as someone you could maybe situate on a spectrum of the fascistic. He has certain qualities, but there are a handful of examples like his lack of focus on class collaboration, his lack of critique of capitalism that would distance him a little bit from classic fascism. But the more that time goes on, the more that he, for example, his protectionism with the tariffs moves him a little bit in the direction of a fascist view on the economy, his populism. So I would certainly say more yes than no. The 1930s fascism expert in me is a little reluctant, but if I were to push back against that, I would say that like what fascism would look like in 21st century America would be different than in the 20s in Italy or the 30s in Germany. And so to that extent, I would say a lot more yes than no, and I have no problem with people who say yes.
So let's get to the etymology of the F word, fascism.
Sure.
Who invented it? Where did it come from? And what exactly did it mean? Did it mean at the time? And perhaps what should it mean today?
Yeah, so fascism as a formal movement developed with Mussolini right after World War I. He was a socialist before he became a fascist, but he became alienated from the socialist movement for a couple of reasons that give us some clues as to what fascism became. He was upset at the anti-war stance of the socialist movement. He wanted Italy to participate actively in World War I. And he was critical of their internationalism. He wanted it to be a nationalist movement. So what he does is he organized what is initially a very small movement of fasci. The term derives from a Roman reference and was actually used not only for right-wingers, but even for left-wingers prior to Mussolini. And he creates what he calls a kind of national syndicalism, what Hitler will later call National Socialism, which is taking certain trace aspects of socialism, its populism, its rejection of capitalism, at least in theory, its focus on creating a popular movement, and it creates this popular foundation for a kind of politics that is ultra-nationalist, is militaristic, that glorifies violence not as a means to an end, but as an end in itself, and aims to destroy the left and sees itself as a kind of a third alternative between Marxism and capitalism, which the Nazis will portray both as being a quote-unquote Jewish disease. So that's in short what fascism is. The challenge with fascism, though, is that fascists historically would adopt and discard ideas and positions as it suited them. They rejected rational consistency, and Mussolini once said, well, if I contradict myself, I don't give a damn. So
well, that kind of reminds me of you know who, doesn't it?
Well, yeah, and Trump is very much like that, right? He'll never apologize for something, even when, of course, he makes a mistake. But he doesn't seem to really care. Oh, one day I said one thing, one day I said another.
So this book is remarkably prescient, Mark. It came out in 2017.
Mm-hmm.
Tell me its history, why you wrote it, and how it's, shall we say, matured. Some books become irrelevant, others become more relevant as time moves on.
Well, yeah, I appreciate that. A little bit about me. I'm a history professor and an activist. I was involved with Occupy Wall Street. I've been involved with various forms of activism, but not actually with anti-fascist activism. That's one area that I never got involved with. In 2017, I went down to Washington, D.C. to protest Trump's first inauguration. And I was struck as I was walking around Washington, D.C. about all of these little kind of confrontations between Trump supporters that had come out of town for the inauguration and people, either counter protesters, everyday people on the street. There was this feeling that the social fabric of our country was fraying in some way. And so I went home and I wrote an essay called Trump and Everyday Anti-Fascism Beyond Punching Nazis, because it was also in response to the famous punch of Richard Spencer, who was at the time probably the most famous avowed white supremacist in the U.S.
Yeah, and I think he was on the ground in Charlottesville, wasn't he?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yep, that was on January 20th, 2017. And then after the property destruction conducted by anti-fascists out in Berkeley to shut down a talk by Milo Yiannopoulos maybe 2 weeks later, there was an interest in the media in Antifa and anti-fascism, but a kind of a lack of quote-unquote expert voices to speak about it. I hadn't published the book yet. I hadn't considered writing the book. I was invited on NPR, and basically Dennis Johnson, who runs Melville House Publishing, heard the interview and said, hey, why don't you write a book based on this interview? And so in a relatively short period of time, I put my activist connections to bear. I put my historical insights to bear, did a lot of research, did a lot of interviews, and wrote this book, which was supposed to come out in September of 2017, but was rushed to the presses after Charlottesville and became the point of reference for talking about Antifa. I did, a million interviews, went on TV, was ultimately denounced by my employer, which was Dartmouth College at the time, visited by the FBI. It was quite a year.
Yeah, it's quite a year. It's also a dream in a way of an author. Come up with an idea, write a piece, get contacted by the publisher. The book comes out, becomes a national bestseller. Why were you questioned by the FBI, and why were you thrown out of Dartmouth? Were you teaching?
Well, I wasn't thrown out. Yeah, so I was teaching at Dartmouth. I'll do the Dartmouth part first. I was teaching at Dartmouth. I was an adjunct. And what happened was I was on Meet the Press, and I spoke about what anti-fascists believe and their perspectives on violence and self-defense. There was I think it was called Campus Reform, if I'm not mistaken, was kind of a student far-right publication whose editor had been a Dartmouth alum. They brought my quotes to the president of Dartmouth College, portrayed them as saying that they're what I believe when I was saying they're what anti-fascists believe. And the president of the college, without consulting me or talking to my department, denounced what he referred to as my endorsement of violence. And then, fortunately, a lot of my colleagues at Dartmouth organized a petition to support my academic freedom, which was very gratifying. But so I was not fired. It was just kind of a public spectacle, which frankly probably generated more interest in my work than anything else.
A little bit of a spanking, but spankings aren't bad in an academic environment.
Yeah, I mean, it got interest in the book. Yeah, well, that's another story. But it got interest in the book, and ultimately, the support from my coworkers was very gratifying.
And then what was the involvement then with, I know you've also been involved with the Occupy Wall Street movement and the Occupy movement more broadly. Did the book come out of that experience?
Indirectly. I wrote another book about Occupy Wall Street and did a tour around Europe talking about it. some of the people that I interviewed for the anti-fascist book were people I met touring around Europe. And I think that Melville House wouldn't have asked me to write Antifa if I hadn't already published a book.
Yeah, we've done lots of shows where we did. I don't know if you know Ece Timurkur, a Turkish activist, has written extensively on it. So one of the pieces in today's press is in The Guardian about whether people should have a moral obligation to protest, particularly not just in No King's Day, but in Los Angeles. Does it really matter, Mark? I'm guessing that the vast majority of my audience, certainly you and I, don't like Trump. Does it really matter what we describe the protests as, whether they're just liberal protests or anti-fascist or anti-racist? Is it important in terms of protests, given your experience in this area, to call it a, so to speak, an anti-fascist, an Antifa protest?
No, I don't think the umbrella term is all that important. I think if you look at protest movements historically, they've been clearer about what they're against in many instances than the specific details of what everyone who's protesting something wants instead. I'm fine with people organizing under the umbrella of being against Trump and against his administration, and in this particular recent week of the protests in response to the ICE raids being against ICE and deportations. What you want to call it, if you want to call that anti-fascist, anti-racist, anti-Trump, or simply some kind of more general protest for justice, to me it is all the same, as long as we can kind of all push in the same direction.
A few people might be watching this, Mark, certainly more conservatives, and say, well, what are you protesting about? Trump was elected. Some of what he's done, again, this is obviously quite controversial, but some of the stuff he's doing is legal. You simply have to accept that you lost the last election, stay at home and focus on 2028 or 2026. What's the point of demonstrating in a quote unquote democracy?
Right. Well, I guess there's two facets to it. Protesting generates public opinion, and public opinion influences elections. A lot of the most progressive legislation that have been enacted in American history has come in response to a social outcry. And so certainly Democratic politicians, I don't think for the most part are eager to do something that steps out of the norm unless they feel pushed in that direction. But, you know, beyond that, there are plenty of people who are critical of the two-party system and critical of, to varying degrees, aspects of the American government and the broader system. So you see both of those things come to the fore in these kinds of No Kings protests and in the anti-Trump protests.
The conservative media and the MAGA media in particular have focused on some of the images from Los Angeles of people burning cars, of waving Mexican flags. Are you concerned that in some ways that some of the violent protests against the MAGA movement can be used by them to actually strengthen themselves politically?
Well, that is an interesting question, right? Historically, certainly, if we want to talk through the lens of fascism, fascist regimes have positioned themselves as victims and position the left as an existential threat, as an enemy that needs to be resisted. Certainly in the case of Hitler, he consolidated power because of the Reichstag fire when a Dutch communist set fire to the German parliament. The other side of it, though, is that fascists always depict themselves as victims, whether they are or not, and have no scruples about misinformation. I mean, I even saw online an example of Fox News using an AI-generated image of flames in Los Angeles when there are actual real images of flames that they could have used instead. So I think that the question for me is less how they will use images of resistance, whether they're violent or otherwise, and more how protesters can create enough of a disruption of business as usual to both force the issue into the national conversation, to force people who maybe disagree with protests, but are concerned about the state of the country to grapple with what can be done around deportations or what can be done around whatever the issue may be. And how can protesters make it so that the kind of cost of continuing these policies starts to scare away people from supporting Trump? Because part of the consideration of the Nazis and the fascists back in the day was, keeping relatively moderate middle-class people on board. And if things become too crazy, that can be difficult. So I think that essentially making it so that business as usual can't go on is the recipe for thrusting the issue into the national conversation and preventing the agenda from moving on. The alternative to any kind of mass militant protest, of course, is simply letting the right do what they want, which is certainly not a winning strategy.
I guess, Mark, it depends on how you think that this Trump thing will conclude. I mean, if it is indeed fascism, if it's in any way equivalent to what happened in fascist Italy or certainly in Nazi Germany, then everybody has a moral obligation to get out on the street and even be violent. But if you think that Trump will just slink away in 2028 and that his current administration will eventually get bogged down and just become more Trump nonsense, then perhaps we should just all stay at home and focus on the next set of elections.
Well, if you're fine with the gamble, then that's your choice, right? The other question is whether you think the status quo as it is good enough. I'm critical of the status quo as it is, and I'm in no way guaranteeing that the political trajectory we are on will inevitably lead to absolute dictatorship. Hopefully it won't, and I think these protests are an important means of making it clear that the political capital necessary to get there is not to be found. But ultimately, if that's even a question of a possibility, which I think for many people it is, then why not, if not march, at least do something to make clear your displeasure with what's going on?
What do you think of the branding of No King's Day? It sounds like Apple Pie Day. I mean, apart from a few bizarre conservatives, Curtis Yarvin, nobody's a monarchist in America. Should these kind of events be a little more pointed? There were some in April that were called hands-off protests. Is the branding important, or is it really just simply more important to get people out on the street?
Well, that's kind of the challenge of, if you make it general, you can pull in more people. If you make it more pointed, you maybe have a stronger political message. Certainly there aren't many monarchists in the US, but it's a little bit of a tongue-in-cheek reference to Trump's aspirations for complete power and the comfort he's had at different times with being depicted as a king, and his talk about running again, even though he won't legally be allowed to in the next election. So, it's kind of like a little bit more of a catchy no dictator day, at least as far as I read it. I'm a radical. I'm critical of some of the ways in which certain liberal groups portray the kinds of struggles necessary to resist Trump. But I am happy that there's going to be a big day of protest and that people will be out there saying that this can't go on.
As you noted, the history of fascism is the history of European right-wing populism, Mussolini and Hitler. What about in America? How indigenous is whatever Trumpism is in the history of America, and what are the best examples in terms of what America's been through? Deborah Baker in Charlottesville points to a number of periods in American history. We've done a lot of shows on this. Obviously, the 1930s, the exceptionalism, the isolationism of America. What period should we be looking at most, Mark, when we making sense of this in terms of American history? You're a professor of history, so you know this stuff inside out.
Yeah, those points are important. For me, I think that you asked before the origins of fascism. I started in the 19 teens, but in a sense, we can stretch this story farther back. There was a famous political theorist named Ami Césaire who argued that Hitlerism was European imperialism and colonialism brought home to the European continent. And so if we take seriously the argument for continuity between fascism and imperialism, then you can argue that the kinds of seeds of what would become fascism existed around the world previously, including the United States. And we can look to how Hitler and the Nazis copied their notion of Lebensraum, of creating living space for Nazis in Eastern Europe, on the depopulation of the American West, that the Nazi eugenics and race science programs were copied to some extent on similar programs in the United States. So in a sense, American racism influenced strongly what the Nazis became. Historian Robert Paxton argues that in a kind of functional sense, the first proto-fascist formation could be seen as being the KKK after the Civil War. So I think that in that sense, the question of whether we should be comparing Trump and the MAGA movement to Europe is important, but we should also be asking, how does it fit into this lineage of American racism, really, and the kind of inevitable backlash that seems to come whenever there are Black freedom struggles in particular, because I don't think we get Trump and MAGA without Obama and Black Lives Matter. And seeing that as a reaction, I think, is essential. And it builds upon, you know, various actual fascist movements like the Silver Shirts or the sermons of Father Coughlin back during right before World War II into World War II. But I think, you know, it runs through elements of the American right that have never really been fully comfortable with Black freedom.
There's the Black freedom, and there's also shall we say, the Jewish issue, or the issue of anti-Semitism. In Charlottesville, Deborah Baker, of course, focuses on the overt Nazi flags at the demonstration. But the MAGA movement is using anti-Semitism in another way to attack the universities and shut down freedom on campus. What do you make of that? It's weirdly ironic that they should be deploying anti-Semitism to actually attack their critics.
Right. So the argument, as I'm sure many of your listeners are familiar, is that critique of Israel is anti-Semitic. I'm Jewish and I'm critical of Israel. I'm an anti-Zionist Jew. And there are actually many people in the Palestine movement are anti-Zionist Jews.
And let me also say, Mark, that one can be a Zionist and still be critical of Israel.
You can be a Zionist and be critical of Israel. You can also be a Zionist and not be Jewish, which is part of the kind of the key to this, which is talking a little bit about Christian Zionism, which is essentially the belief that it is necessary for there to be a Jewish state in the Holy Land as a precondition for the return of Jesus to earth and the coming judgment day when all Jews will either have to convert to Christianity or will perish in hellfire. Right. So Christian Zionism is anti-Semitic. But ironically, it is these Christian Zionists, particularly in the Trump administration, that are casting aspersions on pro-Palestine activists, many of whom are Jewish, for being anti-Semitic. So it's a kind of twisted circle that allows the Republicans to make use of, frankly, cover created also by plenty of Democrats in critiquing pro-Palestine demonstrations and critiquing universities, which the irony in my context is acute because back 8 years ago when my book came out, I was involved in many debates around free speech. And I was told that preventing white supremacists and Nazis from demonstrating on campus was not at all an option because that would be a violation of free speech. Now, a similar kind of question, right? Speech we don't like on campus, and it's fine to ban all of this Palestine activism. It's hypocritical, and it does real damage to the safety of Jewish people to say that Jewish identity has to be tied up into this state project of Israel, particularly as it's orchestrating a genocide.
You mentioned the Black Lives Matter issue. Obviously, America has a unique history of race and racism, slavery, Jim Crow, the civil rights movement. How does that play into the current situation and indeed the history of Antifa in the United States itself? Does that distinguish the US from Italy and Germany and other West European states?
Yeah, so in terms of the history of fascism and anti-fascism, I think we can think through an equivalent to fascism developing from the Klan onward I wouldn't situate it earlier during the era of slavery, because a big part of fascism is this desired return to an imagined past. And in the US, you start to get that once the regime of slavery is destroyed and the Klan wants to return to the past. That kind of militant, paramilitary, populist violence directed against others, in this case, obviously, Black people primarily, though not exclusively, is a kind of fascism to which the African-American community organized a response in various ways throughout the following generations. Some by becoming politicians and working through the system. Obviously, we're well familiar with the legacy of nonviolent resistance championed by Martin Luther King and others. And then there were other efforts at self-defense through the NAACP, Deacons of Defense, Black Panthers, Malcolm X, and so forth. That is, I think, you could categorize as a kind of Black anti-fascism. A new book came out recently. I believe it's called The Black Anti-Fascism Reader or something along those lines, which makes that argument and traces that history. And I would recommend checking it out for anyone who's interested. So those are the kinds of traditions that I think really animate the most important conversations around fascism and anti-fascism in US history. Granted, in the 20s and 30s, you have struggles against fascists in Italian American communities, in German American communities. Jewish Americans were very active in trying to organize, particularly, for example, against the Nazi rally at Madison Square Garden in the 30s. Antifa itself is a kind of politics that developed in Europe after World War II. And then starting basically in the late 80s into the 90s, American radicals tried to kind of copy what was going on in the UK or Germany. But that's why my book is trying to trace that specific lineage rather than looking at a broader American anti-fascism, which has roots that are simply different from what was going on in Europe.
Yeah, and I wonder, my sense is that, in part at least, there's a different reaction to Trump and MAGA amongst black Americans and white Americans. For many Black Americans, it's essentially business as usual. They will say, well, this has always been the case, and it probably will always be the case. Many white Americans, of course, I don't want to generalize about everyone, but many white Americans are much more shocked and surprised. Is that fair, do you think?
Well, there's always the question of continuity and change. And there's always, of course, at least a little of both. But the notion that when Trump was elected, he represented some sort of huge break with American history is just not really borne out by the facts. Sure, he changed the kind of centrist hegemony that you could kind of see from, the kind of Clinton, Bush era. Sure, there were debates about this and that, but both parties were fairly close to the center. He's broken with that, and he's changed the politics of the Republican Party to be more of an explicitly far-right party in a global sense. We could go on and on with the changes he's made, but the notion of presenting an explicit denunciation of Black freedom struggles historically, of really trying to erase Black history and rewrite American history to be the kind of triumphalist narrative that conservatives want, is a return to what business as usual politics were before the civil rights movement. So, I wonder in the future, when American historians of the United States write about this longer history, will there be a period from the 50s to the present that gets bracketed off as kind of some kind of a civil rights era, and then something different is coming? We have no way of knowing. But I tend to be more sympathetic towards those who emphasize continuity rather than change.
One difference between the 1930s and the 2020s is that we have, for better or worse, the internet now. The No King's Day movement has a social media strategy. Some people have been skeptical of the impact of new media, social media, and the internet on all this, suggesting that it's all symbolic and doesn't make any difference, and that it raised expectations about the Occupy movement and even Black Lives Matter. What, in your view, should and is the role of social media and the internet? What could it be used for, and what should we be careful about?
Right. Well, Occupy Wall Street, which I was involved with, is an interesting example because it skyrocketed to international popularity much faster than would have ever been possible without the internet. But after a few months of being popular, the kind of natural flows of, social media interest took their toll to the point where it became passe, and then it just kind of plummeted pretty quickly. Live by the sword, die by the sword.
And in a sense, it was a sort of a footnote in some ways to the Arab Spring, which experienced that also even more dramatically and tragically.
Exactly. And 15M in Spain and other similar movements. So, it grew much faster than it should have and declined much faster than it should have. Previous to that, to the internet era, a movement to get huge would have to work over the course of many years and build a foundation and thereby become more stable and integrate itself more into the everyday life of the people it's trying to organize on behalf. So I think that there is a tendency with the internet for people to look for quick solutions when, getting to know your neighbors or working in communities, there's really no way around that. That having been said, though, I mean, it is a tool. We might as well try to use it. And at the moment, unfortunately, in the social media world, the right is doing a lot better than the left at turning it into a weapon for promoting their vision. So I'm pleased that shows such as yours, but there's a lot of monsters out there using these kinds of platforms for no good. So that's what it is. My real concern, though, is with like deep fake footage and images and videos. What are people going to come to believe over the coming years that's just like absolutely untrue, especially given the right's focus on everything they don't like being fake news?
You yourself, you have an X page, but you're much more focused on other social networks like Blue Sky.
Yeah, I switched
Should
over.
people be careful? I mean, X is obviously owned by Musk, who's no friend of the resistance. Should people be careful, or might it make more sense to actually be on X and be in people's faces and be able to debate with the opposition?
Yeah, I understand that position, and of course, there's the point to be made that all of these, major media platforms are owned by people that we would have some sort of critique with or another.
Probably not Blue Sky, but certainly
Sure.
X, and of course the Zuckerberg network of Facebook and Instagram.
Sure. Yeah, I'm not criticizing people who stay on X and try to promote what they think on X. I made the choice that just it became too much for me to continue to use it.
What's your view? Not of the F word, Mark. I was going to call you Mark, but of the R word, resistance. Is that a good word?
Yeah, I think it is. Although, of course, like any word, it can become so vague that it means such different things to different people that it becomes a little meaningless without filling it in. But I think it's a good place to start, maybe not a good place to end.
So how on No King's Day do we resist? We can, of course, join demonstrations. They're all over the country. But how else should people be doing it? Going on social media? Some people have talked about the idea of a national strike.
Yeah, well, that last one would be my ideal choice is a general strike. Now, that's really hard to organize, especially in a huge country. But
put it mildly, especially in America, where not everyone's even unionized.
Right, of course, right. So I'm not anticipating that's going to happen anytime soon. But in countries like Italy and Germany, the response of the organized left to such a thing would be to try to organize a general strike. Our power as working people is the greatest power we have. Now, that's not about to happen, although I have heard some conversations in certain union circles about it. I could imagine maybe in like a city like Los Angeles, a regional general strike that is successful enough to make a point. I could imagine things like that happening, particularly if the militarization of American cities persists. I saw that a judge ruled against Trump's deployment of the National Guard. I'm not sure how that's going to play out. But I can imagine a local, a regional kind of general strike. Beyond that, though, I think that electoral politics often makes people feel like all they can do is cast a ballot. But I think organizing at a local level, whether it's in a workplace or in a community or mutual aid networks or immigrant rights organizations or, whatever's the local issue where you are, simply being part of a group with people in your community so that you have an organized foundation so you can respond to crises in a way that brings people out, in a way that responds to what's actually happening, is a good way to get beyond the kind of, debilitating feeling of all I can do is kind of show up to a protest and raise my individual voice.
What about the role of violence? When we talk about the resistance, we think of the French resistance to Nazism, the Italian resistance to Mussolini, which was violent. There were, of course, post-war violent movements which saw capitalism as fascism, Baader-Meinhof, the Red Brigades. What's your take, or what do you say about violence in Antifa, the anti-fascist handbook? Is it beyond the pale, or is it acceptable in certain situations?
Well, you gave a good lead into it, right? It was used extensively in resistance to fascism in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, even by some afterwards. And so that raises the difficult question of how bad does it have to get for escalation to occur, for violence to occur? What I essentially analyze in the book is the arguments put forward by militant anti-fascists, the people who call themselves Antifa, form groups called Antifa, or sometimes other things, and organize to stop far-right groups. They do that in a variety of ways, but one of them sometimes is showing up and attacking them, right? So physical violence is one of the tools in the toolbox of that kind of politics. And part of the argument, which you sort of suggest, is that if you remove it from the toolbox entirely, it may be too late before you try to put it back in, which is to say, looking at like the 20s and 30s, for example, the European left didn't really treat the specter of fascism with the utmost seriousness on an international level until after Hitler took power. You can see that, for example, with the international brigades in the Spanish Civil War. So it needs to be an option. Reasonable people can disagree about when it should be utilized, whether it should be utilized in this case or the other. But I think it's an option. And fundamentally, since fascists all value violence as an end to itself, they tend to attack people. I've seen some people who monitor far-right circles talking even about far-right groups like the Proud Boys and others planning to attack people today on No King's Day, which I hope comes not to pass. But it is a concern, and being able to defend oneself and individually and collectively is lamentably necessary when organizing against fascism.
What about the history of violent resistance in the US in the 60s? The Weathermen, they saw the US administration, particularly in Vietnam, as a kind of fascism. What do you say about violent American resistance, especially in the 1960s?
Well, I'm not advocating that anyone dig up the Weather Underground again. But I do think, though...
Or the Black Panthers, I assume.
Yeah. But I do think, though, like, recognizing that history never actually, despite the saying, literally repeats itself. There are similarities, though. And I think that we can look at the Black freedom struggles of the 60s and 70s and say, okay, there were huge disagreements about violence and nonviolence there. But I think that the general consensus among historians is that both factions of the movement played a role in pushing the American government towards civil rights legislation and towards ameliorating the situation that Black people faced. And today, there are going to be disagreements as well. I don't foresee there ever being unanimity among everyone about how to protest. So ultimately, I think that, we can yell at each other and denounce each other, or just accept that fact that people are going to protest differently and try to find a way to not get in each other's way. So like looking at LA, there were people who set fires, set up barricades, fired fireworks at ICE, presumably in the most case in the interest of stopping ICE raids, which are not only breaking up families and detaining, mostly undocumented people, but in some cases, even people with papers, but sending them to, by all accounts, horrific conditions in El Salvador and increasingly, apparently, in Guantanamo. So, I see that as a kind of community self-defense, and I take seriously what ICE is trying to do to people whose only crime is not having the papers that the government says they should have.
Finally, Mark, on No King's Day, we're talking first thing, so it's hard to know what will happen. But Margaret Sullivan is writing in The Guardian yesterday, suggests that the media is ignoring the growing, or she believes that the media is ignoring the growing resistance to Trump. It'd be interesting to see how New King's Day not only turns out, but how it gets reported. Do you think Sullivan's right? You argued earlier that a lot of the point of resistance is a publicity struggle, an attempt to actually make a statement. So far, how has the media, quote unquote, and of course now that would include new media as well as traditional newspapers, how have they responded? How have they covered the quote unquote resistance to Trump?
Well, that kind of ties into our previous conversation, right? The most notable example of resistance they've covered is the flames in Los Angeles.
Well,
right?
Those are dramatic. They're not.
Exactly, right? So that kind of shows a little bit of the paradox of the media poo-pooing property destruction and violence, but gravitating towards it and trying to publicize it 24 hours a day. The flip side of that is what we were just talking about, is people standing around holding signs or marching often gets much less coverage than I think it ought to. And I think that there has been, at least up until recently, a little bit of protest fatigue among a lot of critics of Trump because it's his second administration, in a way that resisting him felt maybe a little more urgent for some people the first time around. And I think you can see that reflected in the media, that ho-hum, here's a few thousand, liberals or leftists marching against Trump. Like we've heard that story before, which is why it's incumbent upon us to do different things. And I think this angle of No King's Day is, say what you will, is different. At least it is something different. I think the question of part of it is they're not protesting Trump's military parade in DC, which is, I think there is something to be said for, like, let's protest where we are. So I don't have a problem with that necessarily. But yeah, well, I think today will be a good test to see if the media takes this seriously, and if they can take seriously resistance to Trump that isn't just explicitly electorally minded, because obviously that's where their real focus is most of the time.
Well, Mark Bray, I hope you have, I was going to say, a happy, safe No King's Day. I'm not sure it'll be particularly happy, but certainly safe. Thank you so much. Very interesting conversation. Your book, Antifa, the Anti-Fascist Handbook, I think it's already been reprinted a couple of times. It's probably going to come out later this year in a third edition. Still enormously relevant. Thank you so much, Mark Bray.
Thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure.